The alarm did not sound like chaos.
Oh, no.
It came quietly.
Oh, God.
A single message moved through command channels across the United States military. Within seconds, the signal reached every branch: Air Force bases, Marine barracks, fighter wings, logistics units. Combat readiness, immediate activation. Across multiple bases, the atmosphere changed instantly. Inside a Marine barracks, soldiers who had just been resting or cleaning their gear suddenly stood up as officers moved quickly down the hallway issuing orders. Bags were opened, boots were pulled on, helmets were grabbed. Outside the building, buses were already waiting. Within minutes, groups of Marines began filing out of the barracks in organized lines, carrying duffel bags and combat packs. Nobody spoke much. They had trained for this moment countless times. But this time felt different. The buses rolled toward the airfield. Waiting on the runway was a massive C-17 Globemaster III, its cargo ramp lowered like the mouth of a giant machine ready to swallow everything in front of it. The engines were not running yet, but the operation had already begun. Forklifts raced across the tarmac carrying ammunition crates. Flatbed carts rolled by stacked with communication equipment, generators, and medical supplies. Cargo crews shouted instructions over the roar of machinery. Inside the aircraft, loadmasters were already securing cargo straps along the metal floor. The Marines stepped off the buses and moved directly toward the ramp. One by one, they disappeared inside the giant transport plane. But this was only the beginning. Because across the base, and across the country, many more aircraft were preparing for the same mission. And soon, the sky would be filled with them. While the first C-17 continued loading Marines, the rest of the base had already shifted into full operational mode. Across the runway, several more C-17 transport aircraft stood in line, their giant cargo ramps lowered to the ground, each one weighted like a steel giant preparing to carry an entire battlefield across the world. Cargo crews moved quickly. Forklifts raced back and forth across the tarmac carrying pallet after pallet of equipment. Ammunition crates were stacked in perfect rows. Portable radar systems, communication units, and medical containers were loaded one by one into the cargo bays. But the aircraft were not just carrying supplies. They were carrying war machines. One after another, armored vehicles rolled toward the aircraft ramps. Heavy MRAP armored trucks climbed slowly into the aircraft, their massive tires gripping the metal ramps. Tactical buggies followed behind them. Military transport trucks, armored personnel carriers, and specialized combat vehicles were carefully driven inside. Loadmasters guided every movement. Hand signals, shouted instructions. Chains were secured, wheels were locked. Every vehicle was strapped tightly to the aircraft floor so nothing would move during the long intercontinental flight. Inside the cargo hold, Marines sat quietly along the side seats, their helmets resting on their knees. Some checked their rifles. Others stared silently at the floor. Nobody knew how long this deployment would last. Another message came through the logistics command. Before heading to the Middle East, several of the aircraft would stop at another base to pick up additional troops and equipment. This mission was growing larger by the minute. On the far side of the airfield, engines finally began to start. One C-17 after another powered up. The deep roar of their four giant engines rolled across the entire base like distant thunder. The airlift had begun, and soon, these aircraft would be crossing the Atlantic carrying thousands of soldiers toward a region that was already on the edge of war. While the transport aircraft were preparing to carry soldiers across the ocean, another critical operation was already underway on a different section of the base. Inside a massive aircraft hangar, teams of mechanics surrounded several fighter jets that would soon be flying combat missions. The atmosphere here was intense but controlled. Every movement followed strict procedure. Technicians moved from one aircraft to another carrying toolkits, diagnostic tablets, and maintenance checklists. Panels on the fighter jets had been opened, exposing wiring, avionics systems, and electronic modules. Nothing was left to chance. One mechanic carefully inspected the radar system mounted inside the nose of the aircraft. Another checked the avionics bay, running diagnostics through the flight computer systems. Nearby, a team inspected the aircraft engines. Engine covers were removed. Flashlights illuminated the turbine blades inside the intake. Engineers looked for the smallest sign of damage or wear that could cause problems during high-speed combat flights. Fuel lines were checked. Hydraulic systems were tested. Flight control surfaces on the wings and tail were moved back and forth to ensure everything responded perfectly. Every fighter jet had to be combat ready. Because once the operation began, these aircraft would not fly just once. They would fly mission after mission. Across the tarmac, another team was preparing the weapons. Missiles and guided bombs were brought out on specialized loading carts. Each weapon was handled carefully as crews rolled them toward the waiting aircraft. Using mechanical hoists, technicians lifted air-to-air missiles onto the wingtip rails of the fighters. The missiles locked into place with a heavy metallic click. Under the wings, larger precision-guided bombs were mounted onto pylons. Electrical connectors were attached. Data links were tested. Every weapon had to communicate perfectly with the aircraft's targeting systems. Finally, the technicians inserted the arming pins, small metal pins with bright red warning flags hanging from them. Those pins were the last safety step. They would stay there until the moment the aircraft prepared to taxi for takeoff. Row by row, aircraft after aircraft went through the same process. Inspection, fuel, weapons, electronics. Everything repeated again and again until the entire fighter squadron was ready. By the time the pilots arrived for their briefing, the jets on the ramp would already be fully fueled, fully armed, and cleared for combat operations. The war machine was coming together. And the first missions were getting closer. Inside another large hangar on the base, a different scene was unfolding. Rows of soldiers stood beside their open bags, preparing for deployment. Unlike the mechanics outside, these men and women were not working on machines. They were preparing their own lives for what could be a very long mission. Large duffel bags lay open on the concrete floor. Soldiers packed them carefully with everything they might need: uniforms, boots, spare socks, gloves, hygiene kits, flashlights, batteries, and personal items. Each item had its place. Years of training had taught them how to pack efficiently for long operations. Some soldiers moved quickly, already familiar with the process after previous deployments. Others worked more slowly, double-checking their equipment. A few sat quietly on benches, tightening the straps on their rucksacks while thinking about the journey ahead. Because this deployment was different. It was not a short rotation. There was no clear return date. The orders simply stated that they would be sent to a military base in the Middle East and remain there for as long as the operation required. Across the hangar, officers walked between the rows of soldiers making final inspections. Weapons were checked. Gear was weighed. Identification tags were verified. Everything had to be correct before boarding the aircraft. Outside, the sound of aircraft engines echoed across the base as more transport planes prepared for departure. The soldiers could hear it through the open hangar doors. Each passing minute meant they were getting closer to leaving home. But nobody complained. This was the mission they had trained for. And now, the moment had arrived. Soon, they would march out of this hangar and board the aircraft that would carry them halfway across the world. Toward a region where tensions were rising fast. Toward an operation that was only just beginning. As evening fell, the base slowly disappeared into darkness. But the activity did not slow down. If anything, it intensified. Powerful floodlights illuminated the runway, casting long shadows across the airfield. The massive C-17 transport aircraft stood ready, their gray bodies glowing under the bright lights. Inside the hangar, the final order finally came. Prepare for boarding. Immediately, soldiers lifted their bags onto their shoulders and began forming organized columns. Boots echoed across the concrete floor as they lined up, row after row. An officer walked down the line giving the final instructions. No speeches, no dramatic words, just clear commands. Moments later, the hangar doors opened fully and the soldiers began marching toward the airfield. Outside, the night air was cool. In the distance, the engines of the transport aircraft were already humming with deep mechanical power. One column after another approached the waiting planes. The giant cargo ramps stretched down to the ground like metal bridges. Soldiers walked up the ramps and disappeared into the aircraft. Inside the C-17, rows of seats lined the sides of the cargo hold. Marines and soldiers sat shoulder to shoulder, their gear stacked beneath their feet. The aircraft was almost full. Loadmasters moved through the cargo bay, checking everything one last time. Cargo straps tightened. Vehicle chains secured. Headcount confirmed. When everything was ready, the loadmaster gave the signal. The cargo ramp slowly began to rise. The heavy metal door closed, sealing the soldiers inside. Outside, the aircraft began to move. One by one, the massive transport planes taxied toward the runway. Their engines roared louder and louder as they lined up for departure. Then the first aircraft accelerated. Its engines thundered as the massive plane raced down the runway. Moments later, the C-17 lifted into the night sky. Another aircraft followed. Then another. One by one, the planes disappeared into the darkness, carrying hundreds of soldiers across the ocean. Inside the aircraft, most of the soldiers sat quietly. Some tried to sleep. Others simply stared ahead. Because once they landed, everything would change. Their destination was the Middle East. And the mission was just beginning. After hours of flying through the darkness, the first transport aircraft finally began its descent. Inside the cargo hold, the cabin lights slowly brightened. A voice came through the intercom. "Prepare for landing." Soldiers adjusted their helmets and tightened the straps on their gear. The aircraft vibrated slightly as the landing gear deployed beneath the fuselage. Moments later, the massive C-17 touched down on a runway deep inside a military base in the Middle East. The aircraft rolled to a stop. But there was no delay. The operation moved immediately. The rear cargo ramp slowly lowered, revealing the bright lights of the airfield outside. Hot desert air rushed into the aircraft as ground crews were already waiting. Soldiers stood up and began moving toward the exit. One by one, they stepped off the ramp and onto the tarmac. For many of them, this place would now be home for an unknown amount of time. Behind them, cargo crews immediately began unloading the aircraft. Forklifts rushed forward and lifted heavy supply pallets from the cargo hold. Mechanics released the chains securing the armored vehicles. Within minutes, the engines of the armored trucks roared to life. MRAP vehicles rolled down the ramp. Tactical buggies followed. Military transport trucks were driven directly toward staging areas across the base. Everything moved with incredible speed. Because this aircraft would not stay long. As soon as it finished unloading, it would refuel and fly back to the United States to pick up more troops, more equipment, and more vehicles. And it would repeat this mission again and again. Across the airfield, more transport aircraft were already approaching the base. The buildup had begun. For the soldiers who had just arrived, there was little time to think. They grabbed their bags, followed the instructions from base personnel, and began walking toward their assigned quarters. Behind them, the sound of more aircraft engines echoed through the night sky. More flights were coming. And the base was preparing for something much larger. While transport aircraft continued arriving with more soldiers and equipment, another operation was running non-stop on the far side of the base. The fighter squadrons were preparing for combat. Rows of fighter jets stood parked along the apron under the open desert sky. Some were positioned inside reinforced shelters, while others waited in the open under powerful floodlights. Maintenance crews worked around the clock. Fuel trucks rolled slowly from one aircraft to another. Stopping beside each jet, a technician stepped down from the truck and connected a thick refueling hose to the aircraft's fueling port. Moments later, JP-8 jet fuel began flowing into the tanks. On the truck's control panel, gauges monitored the fuel levels as thousands of liters of fuel were pumped into the aircraft. When the tanks were full, the hose was disconnected and the truck moved on to the next fighter. Behind the fuel crews came the weapons teams. Specialized loading carts carried missiles and guided bombs across the tarmac. Each weapon was carefully rolled into position beside the aircraft. Using mechanical hoists, technicians lifted air-to-air missiles and locked them onto the wingtip rails of the fighters. Under the wings, larger precision-guided bombs were mounted onto the pylons. Each weapon had to be connected to the aircraft's electronic systems. Technicians plugged in the wiring harness and confirmed the data connection between the weapon and the aircraft's targeting computer. Every step was double-checked. Then came the final safety step. The crew inserted the arming pins, small metal pins with bright red warning flags attached. These pins prevented the weapons from activating accidentally. They would remain in place until the moment the aircraft taxied for takeoff. After the weapons were mounted, another round of inspections began. The crew checked the mounting brackets. They inspected the release mechanisms. They verified the alignment of every missile and bomb attached to the aircraft. Then they moved to the next jet. And the next. The process repeated again and again across the entire flight line. Fuel, weapons, electronics, flight controls, engines. Every fighter aircraft had to pass through the same detailed preparation. By the time the pilots arrived for their mission briefing, the jets waiting outside were no longer just aircraft. They were fully fueled, fully armed combat machines, ready to launch into the sky at a moment's notice. The operation had reached its final stage. And soon, the first combat sorties would begin. Night had fully taken over the base. The desert sky above was dark and silent, but on the ground the airfield was alive with activity. Inside the operations building, fighter pilots sat around a large briefing screen. The room was quiet as intelligence officers explained the mission details. Satellite images appeared on the display, highlighting military targets and flight routes. The plan was clear. The pilots listened carefully as the final instructions were given: flight paths, refueling options, communication frequencies, and engagement rules. When the briefing ended, the room fell silent for a moment. Then the squadron commander stood up. "All right, let's go." Chairs moved back, helmets were picked up, the pilots walked quickly out of the building and into the night. Outside, a transport vehicle waited to take them to the flight line. As they approached the runway area, the sight was powerful. Under bright floodlights, rows of fighter jets stood ready. Their wings carried missiles and guided bombs. Ground crews were already waiting beside each aircraft. The pilots climbed out of the vehicle and walked toward their assigned jets. Crew chiefs met them at the ladder and gave a quick update about the aircraft's condition. Everything had already been inspected and cleared for flight. One by one, the pilots climbed up the ladder and slid into the cockpit. Inside the aircraft, they began their startup procedures. Switches flipped. Screens lit up. Navigation systems activated. Outside, the ground crews moved around the aircraft performing the final steps. One technician reached up and pulled out the red arming pins from the missiles and bombs. The bright red flags fluttered briefly in the night air before being collected. Now the weapons were live. Moments later, the engines began to start. A deep mechanical roar echoed across the airfield as each fighter jet powered up. Heat waves shimmered behind the aircraft as the engines reached full power. One by one, the jets began taxiing toward the runway. Their navigation lights blinked in the darkness. When the first aircraft reached the runway threshold, it paused for only a few seconds. Then the engines roared louder. The fighter surged forward, accelerating rapidly down the runway. Within seconds, the aircraft lifted into the sky and disappeared into the night. Another jet followed. Then another. Soon, a formation of armed fighter aircraft was climbing high above the desert, heading toward their assigned targets. Back on the ground, the maintenance crews watched the lights fade into the distance. They knew the aircraft would return, but not before completing the first missions of the operation. And when they did return, the crews would already be waiting. Because this base would not sleep. Not tonight. Not for a long time.